The morning of January 24th, 1961, began like any other winter dawn in rural North Carolina. Frost clung to the fields like thin sheets of broken glass, and the wind carried the metallic smell of cold earth. The sun was only beginning to stretch its pale rays across the sleepy farmlands of Goldsboro, a place where nothing extraordinary ever happened, and the world felt comfortably distant. But in the upper atmosphere, thousands of feet above the quiet farms and tobacco fields, the fabric of American history was about to tear. At 12:30 a.m., the massive silhouette of a B-52 Stratofortress sliced through the frozen sky. It was one of the most powerful aircraft ever built, an airborne titan designed to carry the deadliest weapons humanity had engineered. Inside its bomb bay hung two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, each capable of releasing a firestorm more powerful than 250 Hiroshimas. The crew of 8 men had flown missions like this before. The Cold War demanded it. Tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was so thick it felt like a physical pressure in the air. Nuclear-armed bombers circled constantly, prepared to strike.
Chapter 3. The Secret That Sank into the Earth. When authorities reached the muddy farmland at dawn, fog still clung to the ground like a heavy blanket. The field near Faro, North Carolina, looked deceptively ordinary until they saw the crater. Sheriff's deputies were the first to arrive. They expected wreckage, they expected fire, but nothing prepared them for the sight of a torn parachute hanging from a tree, its white fabric stained brown with wet soil, leading their eyes to a partially buried steel cylinder longer than a pickup truck. A nuclear bomb. The second bomb had driven itself so deep into the earth that only a crater remained. No bomb casing, no metal fragments, only dark, broken mud. Recovery teams would later dig almost 60 feet down into the ground, trying desperately to find the core. They never found all of it. Some components of the nuclear secondary stage, the part that produced the real megaton explosion, were left under the fields of North Carolina, entombed forever. The farmers were told not to worry. No one believed them. Chapter 4. The Men Who Fell from the Sky. While the bombs lay scattered across the countryside, the crew of the disintegrated B-52 was literally raining down from the heavens. Parachutes opened like pale flowers in the darkness. Some men drifted into trees, others slammed into frozen fields. One crew member, Sergeant Elmo Tanner, never stood a chance. His chute failed to deploy. Captain Hardin landed brutally, breaking several bones, but he survived. The wind howled across the fields as he crawled through the cold mud, searching for his men. He later said in an interview, "It wasn't the fall that scared me, it was the sight of that parachute on the ground. I knew what it was attached to." Thousands of feet above, the last burning fragments of the bomber streaked across the sky, illuminating the night like falling stars. People in Goldsboro woke to the sound and thought the world was ending. Some weren't far from the truth. Chapter 5. Washington Panics Quietly. When the news reached the Pentagon, panic spread like wildfire, silently behind closed doors. This was not just an accident. This was a geopolitical nightmare. A hydrogen bomb almost detonating on American soil? During the height of the Cold War? The Soviet Union would seize it as a propaganda weapon. Congress would erupt. The public would question the entire nuclear program. Billions in defense spending hung in the balance. Military careers could be destroyed overnight. So the Pentagon made a decision. They buried the truth. The official story released to the press was vague, carefully crafted. Chapter 9. The Country That Lived in Fear. The revelation of the Goldsboro incident decades later shocked Americans. But to understand the magnitude of that fear, you must understand the era in which it happened. 1961. The Cold War wasn't just a political standoff, it was a psychological condition. Americans woke up every day to the unsettling reality that somewhere above them, perhaps directly overhead, flew planes with nuclear payloads. Children practiced hiding under wooden school desks as if that would save them from a fireball hotter than the sun. Families dug bomb shelters in their backyards, filling them with canned beans and cheap radios. Newspapers printed maps showing hypothetical blast zones. Teachers explained duck and cover with forced calm while their voices trembled. And across the ocean, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was vowing, "We will bury you." People believed him. In this atmosphere of fear, every accident, every mechanical failure, every miscommunication could be the spark that ignited global annihilation. And Goldsboro wasn't the first close call. It wasn't even the worst one. Chapter 10. The Catalogue of Near Doom. Years later, when historians began peeling back layers of secrecy, they discovered that the United States had experienced more nuclear accidents than anyone had dared to imagine. Internal documents revealed a term the military never wanted the public to hear: broken arrow, meaning a significant accident involving nuclear weapons. There were dozens. But a few stood out, dark stars in a constellation of near catastrophe. The 1950 British Columbia incident. A U.S. bomber flying toward Alaska experienced engine failure and dropped a nuclear bomb into the Pacific Ocean. It didn't detonate, but the plutonium core was never recovered. Locals still whisper that the ocean floor hides a slumbering ghost. The Mars Bluff explosion, 1958. In South Carolina, a B-47 accidentally released a nuclear bomb over a family home. Thankfully, the nuclear core was not armed, but the conventional explosives detonated, creating a crater 70 feet wide and injuring several civilians. The Gregg family never fully recovered. Their house vanished in a single blast, all because of one mechanical latch. The Thule Air Base fire, 1968. A bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed on the ice near Greenland. Pieces of radioactive material melted into the ice sheet and drifted into the ocean. Even now, researchers detect traces in marine life. The Damascus Titan missile meltdown, 1980. In Arkansas, an airman dropped a wrench socket. It rolled, fell, and punctured a Titan II missile tank. The entire launch complex exploded. A nuclear warhead flew out of the silo like a cannonball and landed in a ditch. It didn't detonate, but it could have. When these events were later revealed, Americans asked, if these are the accidents we know about, how many were buried deeper? No one had an answer, except maybe a few men who would never speak. Chapter 11. The Man Who Tried to Warn the World. In the late 1960s, Parker F. Jones grew increasingly uneasy. He didn't want fame. He didn't want controversy. He wanted truth. And the truth terrified him. He wrote in his private notebook, "We treat nuclear safety like a suggestion, not a requirement. We make bombs with the assumption that humans won't make mistakes, but humans always make mistakes." His colleagues thought he was dramatic. Some thought he was paranoid. But Jones was simply honest. He knew the Mark 39 bomb had a safety flaw. He knew. Chapter 15. The President Who Never Knew. In 1961, John F. Kennedy had been president for only 3 days. 3 days. He was still learning the layout of the White House, still memorizing the names of cabinet members, still adjusting to the overwhelming weight of running the most powerful and most terrified nation on Earth. When the Goldsboro incident occurred, most senior officials made a decision. Kennedy didn't need to know. Not yet. He was too new, too politically fragile, too burdened with Soviet tensions, Cuba, Berlin, and the threat of global war. And so, the worst nuclear near-miss in U.S. history happened without the commander-in-chief being fully briefed. Some historians insist Kennedy eventually learned pieces of it. Others claim he never heard the full truth. But one thing is certain. When he later warned Americans that every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, he had no idea how close that sword had come to falling on American soil just days after he took office. Chapter 16. The Chain of Failures. Bomb accidents never have a single cause. They have layers of causes, a chain of small flaws, oversights, malfunctions, and human errors, each harmless alone, catastrophic together. Goldsboro was no exception. Here's what went wrong. 1. A broken fuel line. A tiny crack weakened by extreme cold began leaking fuel rapidly. 2. Excessive weight from the bombs. The heavy nuclear payload increased structural stress on the wings. 3. A flight maneuver that worsened the leak. When the plane banked sharply, the fuel imbalance grew. 4. Chapter 23. The Crash That Shook the Pasture. Before the sun had risen on January 24, 1961, the Wright family farm, one of the most peaceful pieces of land in North Carolina, was transformed into a staging ground for the unimaginable. The Wrights had lived there for generations. Their farm had seen droughts, harvests, births, funerals, everything a rural Southern family could withstand. But they had never imagined they would wake to military trucks blocking their driveway, helicopters roaring above the barn, men in radiation suits inspecting their soil, officers with clipboards taking soil samples. And yet the scariest part wasn't the noise. It was the silence of the soldiers. No one would tell the Wrights anything. Mrs. Wright later said in an interview, "I asked them if it was dangerous. One man just looked at me and said, 'Ma'am, stay inside with your children.' That's all he said. That's when I knew it was bad." To the family, it felt as if Judgment Day had come quietly in the night and left footprints on their land. Chapter 24. The Debris Field. The bomber had disintegrated over miles of farmland, sprinkling lethal fragments like black snow across fields and forests. Investigators mapped the debris field, the tail section in a swampy patch of marshland, the cockpit near an abandoned tobacco shed, a wing in the middle of an irrigation ditch, a fuel tank embedded in a frozen pond, pieces of the fuselage scattered like confetti. But the most disturbing debris wasn't metal. It was paper. Air Force manuals, crew checklists, nuclear safety pages, some of them charred, some of them shredded, some of them showing classified phrases that farmers would never forget. Nuclear arms safe procedures, detonation sequence response, high-yield contingency. Local farmer Earl Thompson picked up a half-destroyed piece of paper and whispered to his wife, "This ain't no ordinary crash." He was right. Chapter 25. The 8 Men Who Rode the Fall. The B-52 crew didn't just fall. They fought for survival. As the aircraft tore itself apart, Captain Hardin shouted commands over the deafening alarm systems. He knew the bomber was lost, but he refused to give up his men without a fight. He was the last person to eject. He delayed until the plane rolled so violently that he nearly blacked out. When he finally pulled the ejection handle, he felt the crushing blast of cold air punch him like a steel fist. His parachute opened, but he drifted near a forest, striking branches before hitting the frozen ground. He lay there for nearly an hour before rescuers found him, his lips blue, his leg broken. Hardin's first question was not about himself. It was, "Did we lose anyone?" The rescuers hesitated. Hardin closed his eyes. He already knew. One crew member, Sergeant Elmo Tanner, never walked away. His parachute failed in the chaos, and he fell like a stone into the darkness below. Every year for the rest of his life, Hardin lit a candle for Tanner. He blamed himself, though no self-blame was justified. Chapter 26. A Hometown in Shock. It didn't take long for rumors to spread across Goldsboro. People gathered in diners, stores, church steps. No one knew the truth, but everyone knew enough to be afraid. Words whispered behind hands. "They say it was a nuclear plane. My cousin saw them take away radioactive stuff. Why's the government buying up farmland? Something fell out of the sky last night." The town sheriff, George. Chapter 6. The investigation that wasn't allowed to happen. The morning after the Goldsboro incident, as frost clung stubbornly to the grass and sunlight began to stretch its pale fingers across the damp fields, a convoy of military trucks rumbled into the quiet farmlands. Soldiers, engineers, radiation specialists, and men in suits with no insignia stepped out, their boots sinking into the soft, muddy earth. To the families living nearby, it looked like an invasion. But no one dared to ask, because the men who arrived carried something even heavier than weapons. They carried silence. The farmers who saw too much. The first civilian to reach the site had been Farmer Ellis Metz, the man whose field had been torn open by the bomb's fall. He had approached cautiously at dawn, lantern in hand, expecting maybe a crashed jet or debris. What he found was a massive crater, a torn parachute tangled in his fence, and pieces of metal large enough to crush a tractor. He didn't know it yet, but just beyond the mud, part of a hydrogen bomb lay buried deep beneath his property. Ellis took 2 steps toward the crater before a military jeep screeched to a halt beside him. An officer jumped out and barked, "Sir, step back. This area is under federal jurisdiction." Ellis frowned. "On my own land?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Especially on your own land." Before Ellis could reply, another man, wearing a black coat and no rank, approached him. Calm, smooth, polite in a way that made Ellis more afraid than the shouting officer. "Mr. Metz," he said, "you've had an unusual night. We'd appreciate your cooperation. For national security." Ellis swallowed. "What exactly fell out of the sky?" The man smiled, but without warmth. "A weather device." Ellis stared at the crater. "That's the biggest weather device I've ever seen." The man's smile faded. "Then it's a classified weather device." And with that, the U.S. government began its cover-up. The search for the missing bomb. The parachute bomb had been found quickly. It lay on the ground, mostly intact, its arming mechanisms frighteningly close to a complete sequence. But the second bomb, the one without a parachute, was a different nightmare. It had hit the ground at nearly terminal velocity. Somewhere beneath the field lay a plutonium core, a uranium spark plug, triggers, conventional explosives, and components capable of unleashing a nuclear firestorm. Chapter 7: The Man Who Wouldn't Let the Truth Die. 30 years passed. The Goldsboro fields grew quiet again. Grass covered the scars in the earth, the fence rusted, the warning signs faded. Locals told stories in whispers. Something fell there. Something big. Government men came and dug up half the county. But they didn't get everything. Children dared each other to climb the fence at night. Hunters avoided the place completely. Farmers swore their cows refused to graze too close to the old crater. But the truth, the real truth, remained sealed in government vaults. Until a man named Robert McNamara spoke up. The day the secret cracked open. It was 1988. The Cold War was thawing. Journalists across the United States were digging into old military operations. A reporter from the Washington Post made a routine Freedom of Information Act request about historical nuclear accidents. Most such requests came back heavily censored. But this time, someone in the Pentagon made a mistake. They released a memo, a short one, but enough to shake the foundations of American military secrecy. The memo stated, "At Goldsboro, 2 weapons were dropped, 1 weapon armed, 1 weapon nearly detonated." Nearly detonated. 2 words that electrified journalists, scientists, and members of Congress. The Pentagon scrambled to retract the document. They called it a misinterpretation. They asked the newspaper not to publish. But the reporter had the memo, and the story ran. Suddenly, people wanted answers. Senators demanded hearings. Historians requested records. Survivors from that rural community came forward. And buried deep in the released file.
Chapter 8: The Journalist Who Opened the Vault. Eric Schlosser never planned to uncover one of the most disturbing secrets in American history. He wasn't a nuclear scientist. He wasn't a Cold War strategist. He wasn't even looking for a bomb. He was looking for the truth. It was the early 2000s. While researching nuclear safety protocols for a book on modern warfare, Schlosser started hearing whispers, stories told behind closed doors, in government hallways, by retired military men who spoke like they were carrying ghosts. Stories about the accident. Stories about the bomb that almost ended America. Stories about Goldsboro. No one gave specifics. No one mentioned official documents, but every whisper pointed to the same night, in 1961. So Schlosser did what great journalists do. He followed the silence. The FOIA War. Schlosser filed Freedom of Information Act requests for everything related to Goldsboro. He received denials, delays, blacked-out pages, files with entire paragraphs removed, documents where only the title remained unredacted. He appealed. He pushed. He insisted. In one letter he wrote to the Department of Defense, "If the American people knew how close we came to losing a state, they have the right to know why." The Pentagon didn't like that. Months turned into years. Most journalists would have quit. Schlosser didn't. And then, miraculously, he received a package, one that contained something no one outside the government had ever seen. The 195-page file. The file wasn't complete. Entire pages were missing. Names had been removed.
Sentences were coded in black ink. But deep inside the stack was a photocopy of a document that would change the world. Parker F. Jones' full report. Not the redacted version, not the censored one, the real one. Inside were diagrams, technical notes, and handwritten comments from engineers who had been at the site. One note read, "The bomb was functionally one step away from detonation." Another, "Had the arm/safe switch been an arm, the result would have been catastrophic." And at the end, "Based on all evidence, there is no question the safety mechanisms failed." Schlosser froze as he read it. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't speculation. It was official. It was documented. It was undeniable. America had been saved by a single electrical switch, a switch that wasn't even designed to stop a nuclear explosion in a crash. The hairs rose on Schlosser's arms. He realized something chilling.
Chapter 9. The Night the Past Came Back to Life. The release of the unredacted Goldsboro files in 2013 hit the American public like a shockwave. For decades, the story had lived in whispers, half-truths told in dimly lit bars, rumors passed among veterans, legends traded between old farmers. But now, the truth was printed on paper, signed by officials, validated by diagrams, outlined in the cold, technical language of nuclear engineering. And nothing, not even the government, could bury it again. A state demands answers. North Carolina's governor at the time, Pat McCrory, received the briefing the same week the documents went public. He read the summary 3 times. Then he whispered, "Dear God." His state had been seconds, maybe milliseconds, away from being wiped off the map. A press conference was scheduled. The nation watched. McCrory stepped up to the podium. Cameras clicked like insects. Reporters leaned forward. He took a breath. "What happened in 1961, he said, was not an incident. It was a prevented tragedy of unimaginable scale. And the people of North Carolina were never told." A reporter shouted, "Governor, do you believe the government covered this up?" McCrory didn't answer immediately. He didn't have to. His silence told the world everything. The families who were never warned. Word spread fast across North Carolina. Elderly residents who remembered the night began calling local news stations. Some had been children sleeping in their beds when the bombs fell. Some had seen fire in the night sky, but had been told it was a weather balloon or a routine exercise. Some had heard the crash. One woman, now in her 70s, told reporters, "I remember waking up to a rumble. The windows shook. My daddy said it was military training, but he looked scared. I never saw him look scared." Another man said, "If that bomb had gone off, my entire family, our church, everything, gone in an instant." For the first time, they realized they had lived through a historical moment without even knowing it, a moment that could have ended them. The Pentagon responds. Facing public outrage, the Pentagon held a rare emergency briefing. A general stepped forward, stiff and expressionless. He said, "We assured the American people that procedures have since improved. Our nuclear arsenal is now safer than at any point in our history." Then in Chapter 10. The accident no one was supposed to know. The postcards wouldn't leave Schlosser's mind. Goldsboro was not the closest call. Look deeper. He had spent years analyzing the 1961 disaster. He had spoken with engineers, historians, Air Force personnel, nuclear experts.
Every one of them agreed Goldsboro was the closest America had ever come to self-destruction. So who was claiming otherwise? A prankster? A whistleblower? Someone from inside the system? Schlosser had seen enough strange things in his investigations to know one truth. When secrecy surrounds a story, the unbelievable is often the most true. He opened his notebook, turned to a blank page, wrote in big letters, "What accident could be worse than Goldsboro?" And the search began. The name that kept appearing. Schlosser returned to the National Archives, buried himself in security logs, accident summaries, coded military memos, and nuclear readiness reports. Most of it was useless. Until, one evening, past closing time, he noticed something odd. A specific phrase kept appearing in deflected FOIA responses. Incident K-23. Always redacted, always referenced indirectly, always marked with the highest classification levels. He dug deeper. Documents refused to load. Catalog numbers were missing. Cross-references pointed to empty files. He recognized the pattern. The file existed, but the government had intentionally erased its footprint. The next morning, he pulled aside an archivist he trusted. "Ever heard of Incident K-23?" he asked casually. The archivist flinched. Then he whispered something Schlosser never forgot. "You didn't hear that from me, but K-23 makes Goldsboro look like a firecracker." A secret from 1968. Schlosser traced the remaining clues until a date emerged. 1968. A year of chaos. Vietnam, riots, political assassinations. But there was something else, something nearly white.
The postcard sender reveals themselves. As Schlosser connected the dots, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. A distorted voice said, "You've found K-23. His breath caught in his throat. "Who is this?" "You're close," the voice said, "but you don't understand the bigger picture yet." "What picture?" A pause. Then, "Goldsboro wasn't the only time a safety..." Chapter 11. The Four Miracles. Schlosser sat at his desk long into the night, the yellowed documents scattered around him like the remnants of a shattered world. The phone call replayed over and over in his mind. There were four near detonations, 4 miracles. His pulse quickened. 4? He had already documented Goldsboro. That was one. K-23 was another. 2 accounted for. But what about the other 2? And what made them miracles? He had to know. The first miracle, Goldsboro Revisited. Schlosser revisited the files on Goldsboro, looking for details he might have missed. He found Parker F. Jones' notes tucked in the margins. Quote, "The bomb passed 3 of 4 arming stages. Single low-voltage switch prevented detonation. Probability of failure nearly 100% if switch had been faulty." End quote. Even decades later, engineers called the event a statistical impossibility. The first miracle was clear. Humanity had been saved by a single, fragile switch. The second miracle, K-23. Next, he focused on the Greenland device, the lost Mark 28. The data were sparse, but enough was left to piece together a terrifying picture. A thermonuclear weapon had fallen somewhere in the Arctic ice, never recovered. Internal logs indicated that 2 of its 3 safety mechanisms failed upon impact. Had the last mechanism malfunctioned,
A megaton-scale explosion could have obliterated Thule Air Base. Millions of tons of ice could have melted instantly. Radioactive fallout might have reached as far as Canada and the United States. Yet no explosion occurred. The Arctic remained silent. The second miracle? A buried weapon did not detonate despite multiple failed safety systems. The third miracle, the Palm Beach incident. Schlosser's next discovery was buried in a memo he almost overlooked. A 1955 near miss in Florida. A B-47 bomber was flying a routine patrol over the Gulf of Mexico when a maintenance error caused one of its bombs to enter a pre-arm state mid-flight. The crew, unaware, attempted to jettison the weapon. The bomb struck the ocean at near-terminal velocity. Its internal firing circuit scrambled and malfunctioning. Internal Air Force records revealed chilling technical details. Quote, 2 of 4 interlocks failed. Detonation unlikely, but plausible. End quote. The bomb sank in
Chapter 12. The Whistleblowers Who Saw Too Much. As Schlosser dug deeper into the archives, he realized that documents alone could not tell the full story. The real danger, the human cost, lived in the memories of those who had been there. The men and women who served in Strategic Air Command, the maintenance crews, and the flight crews had witnessed horrors the public could never imagine. Some stayed silent for decades. Others tried to speak out and were punished. The airman who refused to lie. Lieutenant Howard or Howie Simmons was one of the flight engineers on the B-52 that carried the Goldsboro bombs. He had seen the arming mechanism of the bomb begin to engage as the plane disintegrated. For decades, Simmons told only his closest family. But in the early 1990s, when journalists began asking questions about Goldsboro, he was approached by Schlosser. He whispered, almost apologetically, "Most people think we were lucky, but I saw the wiring, the switches, the sparks. If a single wire had touched the wrong terminal, you wouldn't be talking to me now. You wouldn't be talking to anyone. It was like standing on the edge of hell, and nobody knew it was real." His hands shook as he recounted the incident. Even decades later, he could feel the chill of that night. The engineer who warned the Pentagon. Parker F. Jones, the engineer who had authored the detailed report on Goldsboro, faced relentless pressure. His superiors demanded he downplay the danger. He refused. Jones recalled, "I told them you're playing Russian roulette with 1 million people. They looked at me like I was exaggerating. I wasn't. I was telling the truth." Jones later added that every safety evaluation before Goldsboro ignored human error, environmental conditions, and mechanical fatigue. The Pentagon insisted the risk was acceptable. For Jones, the word acceptable haunted him for years. The maintenance technician who almost caused disaster. In the Palm Beach incident, a young maintenance technician named Tommy Harrington had accidentally left the bomb in a pre-armed state. He described Chapter 13, The Secret Safety Protocols. By the early 1970s, the Pentagon realized that relying on luck to prevent nuclear disasters was no longer acceptable. But rather than publicly admitting the extreme vulnerability of its arsenal, the government implemented secret safety protocols, hidden rules and procedures designed to prevent a catastrophe without ever alerting the public.
These protocols were classified at the highest level, often labeled top secret, eyes only. The creation of the safety network. After Goldsboro, K-23, Palm Beach, and the Midwest crash, the Strategic Air Command, SAC, commissioned a task force of engineers, psychologists, and military strategists. Their goal? 1. Prevent near detonations. 2. Improve mechanical reliability. 3. Train personnel to anticipate failures. 4. Ensure accidents remained undisclosed. The task force quickly discovered the shocking truth. Human error accounted for more potential detonations than mechanical failure. They created a multi-layered system: redundant safety switches, fail-safes in arming sequences, automated shutdown systems, strict maintenance schedules, secret reporting procedures for near misses. Yet for every new system, there was an equally hidden loophole. Engineers whispered among themselves, "The system only works if humans behave perfectly. Humans are never perfect." The psychological operations. In addition to mechanical fixes, the Pentagon realized it had to manage perception. Public knowledge of nuclear accidents could cause panic, erode trust, and provoke political crises. They instituted a covert information control network. Whistleblowers were quietly reassigned or intimidated. Accident reports were coded to mislead casual readers. Local communities near crash sites were paid to stay silent. Media inquiries were deflected with routine military exercises stories. These operations were designed to protect the nation's psyche as much as its soil.
Chapter 14. The Political Shadows. Schlosser had expected resistance, but he had not expected walls. Thick, bureaucratic, unshakable walls built over decades by men in suits who lived in the shadows of Washington, D.C. Every time he requested documents, he got redactions. Every time he interviewed retired officials, he hit rehearsed lines. Every time he uncovered a near disaster, he discovered the incident had been deliberately buried. This chapter of America's nuclear history wasn't written in ink. It was written in erasures. The congressional hearings that never happened. Public trust in nuclear safety fluctuated wildly during the Cold War. More than once, Congress attempted to hold hearings addressing the dangers of nuclear mishaps. But each time, the hearings dissolved before they even began. A 1968 memo Schlosser uncovered revealed the underlying strategy. Proceedings will risk exposing the vulnerability of the national deterrent. Avoid full investigation. Delay until political climate shifts. The political climate never shifted. Every attempt at transparency was smothered by classified briefings, backdoor pressure, and national security arguments. Congress wanted answers. The Pentagon wanted silence. Silence always won. The presidents who knew. Over the decades, several U.S. Chapter 15. The Missing Warhead of Tybee Island. For years, locals in coastal Georgia whispered the same rumor, that somewhere beneath the waves near Tybee Island lay a weapon so powerful it could level an entire city. Most dismissed it as folklore, a fisherman's tale, a ghost story told around campfires. But Schlosser knew better. This wasn't folklore. It wasn't rumor. It was documented fact, buried in government archives and smothered under half a century of denials. The Tybee bomb was real, and worse, it was never found. The Midnight Collision. It was February 5, 1958, just before midnight.
A B-47 bomber carrying a 7,600-pound Mark 15 thermonuclear bomb left Homestead Air Force Base on a top-secret training mission. At the same time, an F-86 Sabre jet was performing high-speed intercept maneuvers nearby. In the darkness, amid poor visibility and miscommunication, disaster struck. At 36,000 feet, the F-86 collided with the B-47. The fighter jet tore itself apart. The bomber's engines groaned. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. The crew had minutes to act. The decision to drop the bomb. The bomber's pilot.
Chapter 16. The night the sky went dark. The Tybee bomb wasn't the end of America's nuclear near misses. It was merely the most visible one. But deep inside Department of Defense archives, Schlosser found references to something stranger, more unsettling, and almost entirely buried under layers of classification. A single phrase appeared again and again in redacted documents. The 1967 incident, strategic failure, no public release. No description, no location, just a date, a timestamp, and black ink. Whatever happened that night was not merely an accident. It was something the Pentagon feared so deeply they never dared speak of it again. Schlosser would uncover the truth, and it began with a blackout. The unexplained power failure. March 13, 1967, 2:17 a.m. A cold, windless night. Across the northern plains, entire Air Force bases suddenly went dark. No lights, no alarms, no radar, no communication systems. Complete power failure. Within minutes, missile silos across Montana and North Dakota reported the same strange phenomenon. Nuclear missiles had gone offline, all of them at once. The nation's nuclear shield, the Minuteman ICBM network, had been blinded. Not by weather, not by sabotage, not by human error. Something else. The radar anomaly. Inside Malmstrom Air Force Base, radar operators frantically rebooted their systems. When the screens flickered back to life, they captured something they had never seen before. A glowing, metallic circular, slow-moving object hovering at high altitude. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a weather balloon, it wasn't debris, and it made no sound. The radar tech on duty later described it. Quote, "It moved like it wasn't obeying gravity. It didn't accelerate, it shifted. One moment here, the next moment 20 miles away." End quote. Within 60 seconds of its appearance, 10 nuclear missiles shut down simultaneously. The object lingered for nearly 30 minutes. When it vanished, the missiles began rebooting. The connection was undeniable, yet the event was immediately classified. The armed warhead. One document Schlosser uncovered was so heavily redacted it was nearly unreadable. But one unedited line remained. Missile L-02 entered partial arm state for approximately 6 seconds. That line stopped him cold. A partial arm state meant internal batteries activated, targeting systems synced, firing logic awakened. If the system's failsafe had been bypassed during those 6 seconds, a nuclear missile could have launched.
The winter of 1874 settled over the Great Plains with an eerie stillness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Miles away from the familiar bustle of St. Louis or the growing industrial pulse of Chicago, the frontier seemed to exist in its own dimension, half untamed wilderness, half promise of a future America struggling to be born. But in the scattered settlements stretching from Nebraska down to Kansas and parts of the Oklahoma Territory, another transformation was taking place, quieter than railroads, slower than the telegraph, and far more personal. The frontier families were beginning to encounter something they had rarely seen before: the rise of federal investigators, men not wearing army blue, but carrying leather-bound ledgers, orders from Washington, and a mission that blended law, politics, and science in ways few understood. Among these new faces was Elias Turner, a field agent tasked with an unusual directive: to track unexplained incidents, strange lights, disappearing homesteads, violent storms that appeared out of nowhere, and whispered accounts of sky fires that had frightened even the most hardened settlers. At first, Elias thought the assignment was bureaucratic nonsense, but after months on horseback, interviewing farmers, Army scouts, railroad surveyors, and traders from the Lakota, he realized something extraordinary. The reports were consistent, and they were increasing. One account came from a rancher who had watched his entire herd spooked into a frenzy by a blinding white flash in the sky, followed by silence so complete it felt unnatural. Another spoke of a night in which the air smelled of metal, and a humming vibration rippled through the floorboards of his cabin. A Lakota elder described a sky serpent twisting above the horizon, shedding sparks like falling stars. These weren't tall tales shared around campfires. These were sworn testimonies from people with nothing to gain by lying. Elias wrote to Washington. Washington wrote back with 5 words that changed the course of his life: continue. Do not alert public. He obeyed. But in the winter of 1874, something happened that made silence impossible. The night of the shattered sky. It began near the Arkansas River, where a small settlement known as Red Hollow lay tucked among low hills. There were 18 families living there, farmers mostly, with a few former soldiers who had stayed west after the war. They were used to hardship, drought, and the occasional lawless drifter, but nothing prepared them for the night the sky broke open. Around 2:30 a.m., a thunderous crack erupted above the valley. The sound wasn't like lightning. It was sharper, metallic, as if the heavens were tearing apart. Residents jolted awake. Doors opened. Lanterns flickered to life. Then they saw it. A vast spiral of blue-white fire hung above the ridge, rotating slowly, silently. It cast long shadows across the land, warping the ground's colors and making the horses.
The presence of the Pinkertons changed everything. Elias had dealt with them before. Private detectives with government-level authority, but none of the accountability. They weren't loyal to the country. They were loyal to money. And whoever had hired them must have known something, or at least suspected the same thing Elias was beginning to believe. This phenomenon wasn't just a natural curiosity. It had
The echo of boots in the dark. The footsteps grew clearer, 5, maybe 6 pairs, descending with careful precision. Elias signaled the lantern down and ushered the others behind a low ridge of stone that jutted from the chamber wall. The humming object at the center continued its slow rotation, unbothered, its blue pulse illuminating the chamber like a heartbeat of another world. Thomas drew his revolver. Miriam clutched the telegraph key she had kept in her pocket. Abel's hand tightened around his hunting knife. Rosamond pressed her back against the wall, breath quick, eyes calculating. Elias peered over the ridge. Black coats, wide-brimmed hats, long rifles slung across their backs. Pinkertons. 6 of them entered the chamber, lanterns raised high. Their faces were hard, expressionless. These weren't ordinary field agents. These were operatives, men hired for missions so secret even Washington didn't always know about them. The lead agent, broad-shouldered, a thick beard and a scar running from his ear. The chamber shook as the heavy footsteps grew closer.
Elias forced himself to stand, though the energy waves still made his muscles tremble. Rosamond, Miriam, Thomas, and Abel rose behind him, forming a tight circle. The Pinkertons huddled near the staircase, their rifles trembling in their hands. Even their leader, a man hardened by decades of violence, stared upward with terror widening his eyes. The footsteps reached the final step, and the figure appeared. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't something from myth or nightmare. It was a man. A man wearing clothes unlike any tailored in the 19th century. Fabric smooth as river glass, stitched with threads that shimmered faintly under the chamber's blue glow. His boots made no sound. His eyes, pale silver, reflected the hovering device like mirrors. He raised one hand. The device answered. It pulsed once, and every lantern flame in the chamber extinguished in the same instant. Darkness swallowed the room. Then the device lit again with a softer glow, enough to show the stranger stepping toward them. "I am sorry," he said, voice calm, steady, resonating deeper than sound. "You were not meant to find this place." Elias felt the words vibrate inside his ribs. Rosamond stepped forward. "Who are you?" A man hesitated. "A witness, a guardian, a reminder." His eyes drifted upward, toward the world above the chamber. "This device is not from your time." Thomas squinted. "Your time?" The man nodded slowly. "Your nation is young. Your world is fragile. This valley is a wound in time, opened long ago by those who studied forces beyond their wisdom. The spirals you see, the disappearances, the resonance in the ground, these are symptoms." Miriam clutched her telegraph key. "Of what?" "Of a breach." The chamber rumbled. Dust drifted from the ceiling. "You touched the core, and now the breach widens. If left unchecked, it will swallow these lands, your towns, your future. Entire generations could disappear, like the families of Red Hollow." Abel stepped forward. "Can it be closed?" The stranger looked at him with something like respect. "Yes, but not by force, not by weapons, only by choice." He gestured toward the device. "One among you must